can't really think of a more evocative archetype in Magic than Reanimator. Maybe it's a consequence of them calling the discard pile the graveyard, but it feels like the idea of bringing a powerful creature back from the dead to fight for you is, I don't know, one of the biggest flavor wins in all of Magic the Gathering. And this idea has been with the game since the very beginning. Animate Dead was printed in alpha, and with it, it kicked us off on this journey of necromantic discovery that has reached the ultimate heights of the game. Not only is it one of the oldest archetypes, but also one of the most successful. But there's a whole lot more to the archetype than just throwing a creature in the graveyard and bringing it back from the dead. So today, let's explore the history of the Reanimator archetype, its different play patterns, and how we might go about including this type of design in our own games. Let's get into it.
Distraction makers.
So our journey begins way back in 1994, and the first Reanimator deck didn't really look like what we would assume a normal Reanimator deck looks like today. It was a deck introduced by Mark Chalice called The Machine. The way that it would work is that you would get Hell's Caretaker into play, you would get a Tetravis into play, you would remove the 1/1 counters to get 1/1 creatures, and then you would sacrifice Tetravis to get back either another Tetravis or a Triskelion, and you just continue in this machine that would ultimately produce lots of card advantage through the 1/1 tokens or through damage through Triskelion. So you could remove your opponent's creatures, you could constantly make more creatures to attack your opponent with, and ultimately crush your opponent through card advantage. The deck itself didn't really include any of the really big creatures that most people would think about when they think of a Reanimator strategy, things like Lord of the Pit, Force of Nature, or some of the Elder Dragons like Nicobolas. And so it would actually be a few more years before the archetype's namesake deck would enter the format. So finally, in 1997, we get The Reanimator, which is named after the H.P. Lovecraft story. It's also a pretty great horror movie by Stuart Gordon. The actual Reanimator archetype was brought to us by Alan Comer. And at this point, we can start to see the building blocks of Reanimator really forming, with the idea that you're going to play a really big creature, you're going to play ways to bring it back from the dead once it's in your graveyard, and then you're going to play some kind of way to get that creature into your graveyard. The other deck that Alan Comer created in this same archetype was known as Comer-Zilla, which is basically, it's just another Reanimator deck, but this was kind of the standard version of the deck, which didn't have access to all of the same powerful pieces. So instead of playing something like Bazaar of Baghdad in order to discard your big powerful creatures to the graveyard to be able to reanimate them, this deck would play Merfolk Traders or Firestorm as ways to discard your big creatures. Not too long after, we would actually have a return to something that looks a little bit more like The Machine, where you have an engine established rather than a sort of spiky single-time reanimation target. So in 1998, when Exodus introduced Survival of the Fittest and Recurring Nightmare, a return to the engine-style reanimation occurred with the deck Cali Nightmare. Cali Nightmare is created by Brian Selden, which he played at the 1988 World Championship. This uses Survival of the Fittest to not only be able to tutor for creatures, but also as a discard outlet to put them into the graveyard to ultimately reanimate with Recurring Nightmare. So this is even a step past what we were seeing with The Machine, in that now you're using the sort of Reanimator shell as kind of a toolbox mid-rangey strategy where you are able to play one-ofs in your deck to search up and then with Survival of the Fittest to tackle whatever it is your opponent is attempting to execute. The other thing that's interesting with this list is because the reanimation isn't an enchantment that enchants the creature like Animate Dead is, things that previously weren't able to be reanimated, like Spirit of the Night, because it's why it has protection from black, so that you can't reanimate it with Animate Dead. But Recurring Nightmare doesn't care. You can just put the creature into play, and we start to get this clearer picture of what reanimation spells would look like going forward. So Cali Nightmare was able to play Spirit of the Night as one of its big finishing creatures. And then in 1999, we would see a mono-black control deck show up that used reanimation not as sort of its plan A, but as part of the card advantage package that it was playing, especially when it was playing things like Phyrexian Negator and Phyrexian Plague Lord. You would want ways to remove these creatures from play if your opponent was going to do damage to Phyrexian Negator, because you'd have to sacrifice a bunch of permanents. So in this way, you could sacrifice the Negator and you could bring it back into play during a more opportune moment. And in the following years, we would see kind of an evolution on this strategy with the deck Nether-Go. And this is kind of Reanimator adjacent, right? We see a creature that has an ability to reanimate itself, and then we're using that as a card advantage engine so that we don't have to worry about keeping our creatures alive. Our win condition in the deck can go into our graveyard, be discarded to some of our card draw effects, like something like Factor Fiction. If our Nether Spirit is put into our hand or our graveyard, we don't really care. It can go either place. We can still have access to it in order to use that as our win condition to win the game. This particular breakthrough, I think, creates kind of the through line for some of the most successful Reanimator decks. But then, with the release of Odyssey, everything changed for Reanimator. This was when it got some of its most powerful tools, specifically the card Entomb, which is 1 black, instant speed, search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard. This card opened up the archetype like never before. In fact, we were seeing this card itself being played in Legacy all the way up until this year when it was finally banned to keep the archetype in check. But yeah, in 2003, we saw sort of Reanimator 2.0 piloted by Pierre Kroger up to the quarterfinals of Worlds in 2003. And this does look like your classic Reanimator deck. We're playing large creatures, we're playing ways to reanimate them, and we're playing ways to get them into the graveyard. And we're even playing creatures in the deck that we wouldn't really be able to play otherwise, right? The goal is to get them into your graveyard and reanimate them, not necessarily play them. We've got cards like Phantom Neshoba and Symbiotic Worm, Arcanist the Omnipotent. The deck doesn't even really have a way to make mana to cast these creatures in a way other than reanimating them. And the other little interesting piece of tech here is the incarnations. This one plays Anger specifically to give your creatures haste, so your big reanimation targets will be able to come into play and attack immediately. So after we had the return to a more classic style Reanimator, a few years later, we would get a return to the engine style of Reanimator again. And this was with the deck Greater Gifts. Greater Gifts was piloted by Frank Karsten to the semifinals of Worlds in 2005. And the deck itself, similar to the Hell's Caretaker engine, would reanimate creatures with Goryo's Vengeance, putting them into play, getting an attack with them, and then sacrificing them to greater good to draw cards. And then on top of that, the creatures that you would play would all have some kind of an effect that they did something when they died. This was majorly powered by the Kamigawa Dragons, with Kakusho gaining new life and having your opponent lose life when it died, but most importantly, Yosai. Yosai the Morningstar costs 4 and 2 white, has flying. When Yosai the Morningstar is put into a graveyard from play, target player skips his or her next untap step and then allows you to tap up to 5 target permanents that player controls, and it is a 5/5. This feels quite similar to the deck The Machine with Hell's Caretaker and Tetravis, this looping of creatures from the graveyard for card advantage, but this one felt more explosive and more like kind of a combination of classic Reanimator and The Machine. Okay, in 2006, now we have the next evolution in the archetype, and this is where we see traditional classic Reanimator put into a control shell with the deck Solar Flare. And Solar Flare is actually named after Angel of Despair because she kind of looks like Krillin from Dragon Ball Z. Krillin's final big move or whatever is called Solar Flare, so that's where the deck gets its name. A lot of people who played Standard around this era, like I did, remember Solar Flare quite fondly. It was the first time when you had this kind of combination of Reanimator and Control where you were playing big creatures that you probably could play otherwise without needing to reanimate them, but it gave you this explosive way to get these creatures into play some amount of the time. At times when you wanted to be the controlling strategy, you would lean more into the control elements of your deck, and times when you needed to put your foot on the gas, you could lean into the Reanimator side of things and get these sort of explosive draws that could just win the game kind of out of nowhere. The major breakthrough here was a way to mitigate the discard side of powerful draw effects like Compulsive Research, where you would draw cards and then discard cards into your graveyard. And so you're thinking about, well, if I'm discarding these cards anyway, how do I get more advantage out of those cards that are now in the graveyard? There was kind of this convergence of ideas in card design where not only would you get a reanimation effect, but you would get one with flashback in Dread Return. And Solar Flare would be piloted by Min-Soo Kim in Worlds of 2006 to a 5-1 record. Just a year later, we'd have another evolution in reanimation strategies. And this one starts to look a bit more like a lot of the sort of scam and tempo strategies that we see today. And this was because of the Lorwyn evoke elementals. Similar to how Solar Flare sought to mitigate the discard side of the really powerful draw spells, this sought to take advantage of the fact that a creature had its own way to put it in the graveyard with the evoke elementals. So you would evoke something like Mulldrifter or Shriekmaw, and then it would be in your graveyard to be reanimated with Makeshift Mannequin. Makeshift Mannequin costs 3 and a black. It's an instant. Return target creature card from your graveyard to play with a Mannequin counter on it. As long as that creature has a Mannequin counter on it, it has, when this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. And of course, with these two things in conjunction, you don't really care if your Shriekmaw or your Mulldrifter was targeted because you've already gotten the card advantage from it. And so this created this sort of powerful, kind of mid-rangey, grindy strategy that would use the evoke elementals and then bring them back for further value. And then not too long after, we would have the second incarnation of Solar Flare. And this is where we finally start to see Reanimator sort of have its most successful days in the standard format, piloted by Ali Antrazi in Worlds of 2011. And really the major breakthroughs here are that you just got sort of more powerful cards that would enable this strategy. I am mitigating the sort of discard loss effects of my cards by putting things that have flashback or things I want to reanimate into my graveyard. The cards of note here are Liliana the Veil, Think Twice, Forbidden Alchemy, and of course, Unburial Rites. The reanimation targets at this time were also quite powerful. You got things like Grave Titan, Consecrated Sphinx, and of course, Elishnorn Grand Cenobite. Later on, this deck would also play Sun Titan along with Phantasmal Image. The list that I found didn't actually have this combination in them, but I remember from the time where you would reanimate Sun Titan, and then Sun Titan would come into play getting a Phantasmal Image that was also in the graveyard, which would then come into play copying the Sun Titan, giving you another Phantasmal Image. You would just sort of use Sun Titan as like an extreme value engine at that point. But yeah, this Solar Flare sort of paved the way for this control type strategy with kind of a Reanimator sub-theme, and ultimately this, in the standard format, would become kind of the most powerful, most successful version of Reanimator. And it would only be a year later when we would see sort of the evolution of Solar Flare in the deck called Frites, which is a sort of portmanteau of Faithless Looting and Unburial Rites, and this used exactly the same sort of strategy. You're taking one of the most powerful draw engines in the game in Faithless Looting, and you're mitigating the discard effects through reanimation and through flashback effects. And the other thing that this deck got was the printing of Gristlebrand. Gristlebrand is maybe the most powerful reanimation target in the game. The only one that might one-up Gristlebrand at this point is Atraxa. However, Gristlebrand, only being in black, also just straight drawing you 7 cards for 7 life, is just extremely powerful. Frites is credited to Brad Nelson for its development, and we would see this deck evolve and change over the course of that standard format. It would sort of start to become a bit more mid-range when it would include things like Thragtusk and wouldn't be so all in on kind of this Reanimator plan with in the initial build with things like Necrotic Ooze, trying to get access to Gristlebrand's very strong card draw ability. But really, again, we do see the same kind of recurring theme, which is that you are using powerful draw spells with discard and mitigating the discard effects through reanimation and flashback. In this instance, we're getting access to Lingering Souls, Unburial Rites, and of course, Faithless Looting. And Frites is kind of the peak of Reanimator in the standard format, at least until recently, where we did see some other reanimation strategies pop up from time to time with things like Cruelty of Gix, but mostly we hadn't really seen much of a dedicated Reanimator archetype until Dimir Excruciator. Now, of course, this is an overview of a Reanimator in specifically the standard format. The archetype has been successful in Modern and Legacy as well. But today we're just mainly focusing on the evolution of the archetype through Standard, as that was how it was sort of pioneered and sculpted over time for these various different play patterns. When you think about Reanimator's different play patterns, we can kind of split them into roughly 4 different archetypes. We have Classic Reanimator, which focuses on big creatures and ways to get them into the graveyard and then bring them back. This was decks like the original Reanimator, also known as Comer-Zilla, or Reanimator 2.0 in 2003. Some of the more famous cards of the archetype are things like Entomb, Putrid Imp, and different looting effects like Merfolk Looter. You're going to be playing reanimation cards like Animate Dead, Necromancy, and Reanimate. And then you're going to be playing really powerful creatures that you might not be able to cast otherwise. This is where things like Atraxa, Archon of Cruelty, Gristlebrand all come in with these cards that cost an obscene amount of mana, sometimes lots of colored pips, or lots of, either lots of specific colored pips in Gristlebrand's case, or lots of diverse color pips in Atraxa's case. The next sort of sub-archetype for Reanimators is Control Reanimator, and this is really built off of the back of ways to mitigate the discard side of powerful draw effects. And so you're taking advantage of those discard effects through reanimation spells and flashback. So the decks that fit firmly into this category are things like all the way back with Nether-Go, but then more solidly with Solar Flare and Frites. The cards that are enabling the strategy are things like Compulsive Research and Faithless Looting. The reanimation style effects tend to have flashback, so that's things like Burial Rites and Dread Return. And then the threats that these decks play tend to be things that you might be able to play anyway because you're a control deck and you want to make it to the late game. So cards like Angel of Despair, Elesh Norn, Grave Titan, and eventually Gristlebrand. The third reanimation sub-archetype is the Machine archetype. And this focuses on reusable loops for card advantage. You're looking for A plus B engines. And the decks that utilize this strategy are the Machine, Cali Nightmare, and Greater Gifts. And the cards that enable these strategies are Hell's Caretaker and Tetravis, Survival of the Fittest and a Recurring Nightmare, and Goryo's Vengeance and Greater Good. And these decks aren't necessarily interested in resurrecting huge creatures from the graveyard. They're more using reanimation as a card advantage engine. And there's also a sub-theme of what is considered a toolbox strategy, where you're going to play a lot of different types of cards to be able to tutor them out into play to morph your game plan into something that counters what your opponent is doing. And finally, we have the Scam archetype. And the Scam archetype focuses on taking advantage of creatures that can get themselves into the graveyard. The decks that follow this game plan are the Mannequin deck from Lorwyn Standard, Dimir Excruciator more recently, but mainly we've seen this type of strategy in the modern format because of the Modern Horizons Evoke Elementals. And those are like particularly powerful ways to get a creature into play, get an effect, and then bring it back from the graveyard to get that effect in additional time, especially things like Grief and Fury, where you could evoke them and then reanimate them, and then you're getting the evoke effect multiple times. There's kind of like a sub-strategy here that I would put in this category, and that's with things like Living End or Living Death in Living End in the modern format, where you're cycling a bunch of creatures to your graveyard and then you're mass reanimating them. I would kind of put that in this category too. In the Evoke Elementals case, you're looking for more of like a tempo play. In the Living End side of things, that's more of a like dedicated combo deck. But I think the fundamental enabling factor here are cards that can get themselves into the graveyard. Cycling creatures really fall into that category too, especially something like Troll of Khazad-dûm. Whew. Okay, so that's the history of Reanimator and the different ways that it presents itself within the play patterns of Magic the Gathering. And I think that this archetype is so diverse and interesting, and we continue to see it evolve today. It also proves to be quite resilient, even though Entomb was banned in Legacy, which is arguably Reanimator's most powerful enabler. It's still sort of starting to crawl its way back from the grave with like a new take on Rakdos Reanimator there. As long as we have big creatures that we want to bring back from the graveyard in the game, and we keep getting new and more powerful ones, with things like Gristlebrand and then more recently Atraxa, there's going to be an incentive to figure out a way to bring those creatures back into play from your graveyard. It is interesting that Entomb was the sort of card that needed to be banned out of Legacy. I do wonder if... I think part of the issue is that when the Reanimator archetype gets a little too easy, it's the package is too tight, right? Like you can Entomb, Reanimate, and then play, a hand like one or two large creatures, and the rest of your deck can be kind of focused on a different game plan. You start to create this weird kind of shell game where when you go to sort of the sideboarded games, you can completely swap your game plan. So if usually reanimation strategies are weak to graveyard hate, things like Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void, but if you're able to just sort of barely dip your toe into reanimation strategies and then in your sideboard swap to some other kind of combo that doesn't really care about the graveyard, your opponent is going to have a hard time countering what it is you're doing. I get the sort of Entomb ban. It's a little bit of a bummer that was something that needed to be taken out of the format, and hopefully in the future it can return. So yeah, what do you think? Any parts of Reanimator's history that I missed here? Is there any particular favorites that you've had over the years? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you'd like to continue the conversation and join a community of like-minded game designers, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description below. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. I will see you next time.